And so today we're talking about 4.5, the first part of it at least. We're going to talk about tools you can use to better encode and retrieve memories. These are things that you can probably use even as a student. I highly recommend using them as a student, as they are how we create this bank of knowledge in our brains. So let's get into it. The first and foremost, most important thing is pay attention. Pay attention. Do whatever you can to help yourself pay attention. And that's not just a teacher being annoyed by cell phones. That is data driven. Pay attention. We go back to the encoding process, right? You require attention to a novel or important information for us to put even anything into our short-term or working memory. We're absorbing some information at all times into that iconic and echoic memory, but for the most part, we're not encoding it and creating memories with it if we're not paying attention. We have to actively pay attention and choose to focus on something in order for us to remember it. So a couple ways to help us encode these things, most of which include paying attention. So here's the first one, and this is known as chunking, organizing things into meaningful units, not just looking at a list in whatever way you can, but organizing it. Even just like alphabetizing something is a great way to help you remember it. So chunking is, for instance, here's a couple different examples, right? Looking at number 3 and number 4 here. These are the exact same, but they're rearranged. Do you think you can memorize this first one or the second one more easily, right? Clearly, you can remember nickel, 7, any, in, stitch, don't, right? Whereas this, you're going to struggle with. But even better, if we look at 5 and 6, if instead of that, we rearrange those into make meaningful lines. Look at 5 and 6. Do you think you could remember this better? Saves a go, a score time, and 9 wooden 4 years take. Or don't take any wooden nickels. 4 score and 7 years ago. A stitch in time saves 9. Clearly, this one's going to be easier because it's meaningful. Your brain puts in like 1/10 of the effort to hold on to a meaningful thing. For Americans, of course, this is easier, but it's also very contextually driven, right? Like if you're trying to understand Mandarin, Cantonese, Taiwanese, Korean, like languages that you don't recognize the symbols, this is not something that I would be able to memorize in, it would probably take me 5 minutes of practice to make sure that I got all of the strokes correct for me to recreate it. Whereas someone that spoke fluent and could read fluent Mandarin would look at that and be like, yeah, got it, next. Right? They would know that immediately. They'd recognize it. So the way that we understand the world, we have to use that to our advantage to order chunk things together, right? Our brains do this automatically, but this helps our working memory save on some of its processing power. Mnemonics are maybe the most well-known. These are any form of kind of those memory aids, those that use imagery, organizational devices, right? Roy G. Biv, in order to remember the colors of the rainbow, right? Order of operation. PEMDAS, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. Right? Easy, right? These are things that we can remember quickly in order for us to remember things that we may struggle to remember. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, right? That's not as easy as my friend Roy G. Biv, right? Easier to remember. An acronym. Love acronyms. Pegword systems, these visual imagery. There's lots of great examples of this. If you go into this PowerPoint and watch these videos, like there are competitions of people memorizing decks of cards and being able to do that in like less than a couple minutes. Because they use these systems known as like peg systems. Things like 1 is a bun, 2 is a shoe, 3 is a tree, 4 is a door. And so what you're doing is you're associating one thing with the other. It's like the first thing in the list, you imagine a visual of whatever that thing was in the list and cooked into a bun. Right? 2 is a shoe. Whatever the second thing is the list, 2 it goes into your shoe. So if you're trying to remember a deck of cards, you're right. All right, 6 of hearts. All right, I've got a 6 of hearts sitting on top of a honey bun. 2 is a shoe. All right, 2. I've got a what's in the shoe? In the shoe, I've got an 8 of clubs sitting in the shoe. 3 is a tree. in a tree that's shaped like the 9 of spades, whatever, something like that. Once you have your peg system down, you memorize that, you can then more easily go through the different steps of that. These take some work to create, but when you create these, they're able to help us memorize long lists very easily. The more and more you practice this, the better you get at it as well. Again, there are competitions for people to see how fast they can memorize a deck of cards, most of whom use things like the peg system or the method of Loki, or known as a mind palace. If you've ever watched Sherlock, he talks a lot about his mind palace. This is really just using something that you have memorized, something or some place that you know in your mind very, very well, and using that to create a system of order to it. I know there's other memory competitions where they're trying to memorize like massive lists or like letters in pi or something like that. And there's a woman that the world champion. She talks about how she lives in New York and she takes a like 6 to 8 miles walk that she walks up and down and basically does like the entire borough of Brooklyn. And she's memorized that walk. She takes it like multiple times a week, and along the way, she has different things that she knows that she sees. And then whenever she's memorizing something, she's like, I put this in the trash can on 45th Street. I put this on the billboard on 46th Street. I put the number 74 is something like that. So method of Loki, and you can do this in whatever way you want. Mind palaces can be used in like a very linear fashion, or they can be used as like a way to organize anything. I know I had friends, some of the people that went to med school with Annie, that often talked about how they used a mind palace in order to memorize things like the chambers of the heart, to memorize the anatomy of the human body, the routes through which the blood was pumped throughout the body, like understanding all of these things. And they would organize it into different portions of their body, or different portions of their room, so that they could help understand it. Like, to understand the heart, I have to go into my organization of my like Tupperware drawer, and I think about where all those things are, and I can like visualize it, and then I pull the different things out and help me remember all the different stuff. So this can be used for lots of different things. Other ways to improve, making it meaningful. We talked about semantic memory a little bit in class, but this makes things wildly more easy. Again, Ebbinghaus found that it was 1/10 of the amount of effort to memorize something that was meaningful, right? Compared to nonsense syllables. I'll go back to here, right? Much easier to remember, don't take any wooden nickels, than Klsisny, Nevesi, Nyani, Kstino, right? Like, these are just nonsense letters. That's going to take you a long time to remember that perfectly. Nickel 7 and any stitch don't. A little easier, but don't take any wooden nickels. Very easy to remember. The more meaningful it is, the better. And as I tell you with psychology all the time, the self-reference effect, the more you apply it to yourself, the easier you'll remember it. Apply things to yourself. Whatever we're doing in psychology, think about how you could use it. So whenever I'm talking about memory techniques, think about how you could use these to learn things. Then what is really happening is the difference in shallow and deep processing. Shallow is basic level of encoding. This is like the structure, the appearance of words, what they look like, whereas deep processing is more semantic encoding. It's based on the meaning of words. What do things mean? Okay, instead of just thinking about like what a word looked like, the semantics of it, the deep processing is much easier. So practice is big. The more you space it out is even more important. The more that we space out our learning, the more we retain that information, which is why cramming for exams doesn't really work. It'll maybe get you to where you can get past that one exam, but if you have to have that information at all at a later date, it will not help you, because it's probably going to disappear, both because you're either not sleeping the night before, which is where we create memories, but also Ebbinghaus showed that the more we sleep in between, the more nights that we study, the more we are able to kind of rehearse and retain that information. Right? It kind of reinforces our long-term memory. So we've got to rehearse. We have to rehearse that information. Otherwise, it doesn't ever truly go into our long-term memory. So different types of rehearsal: maintenance and elaborative forms of rehearsal. Maintenance rehearsal is the very basic level. This is like you're cramming. It's repeating something to yourself. Right? It helps hold something in our memory, but it's not going to keep it there. Whereas elaborative is new information, it's actively viewed and related to info already stored in our long-term memory. This improves our organization, this encourages our deep processing, and it increases our connections in the brain. Okay, so that was kind of the encoding processes. Now we're going to talk about our ability to pull stuff out of our brain and how we can help with that in some way. So retention and our ability to pull things out of our brain oftentimes is broken down into recall, recognition, and relearning. Recall is being able to retrieve information learned earlier, whereas recognize is just seeing something that you know. This is the difference between short answer questions or essays and multiple choice, right? Short answer essays are a lot harder. You have to pull the information. You have to provide the information. Recognition only asks you to recognize something. You're like, I don't recognize A, B, and C, but D, I do recognize, and I think that's the right answer, right? Multiple choice test. Relearning is learning something afterwards, and there is a huge boost for that. It's why relearning information for for your finals is easier than learning it the first time, right? Because even though you learned it in maybe August or September, you still had it in your brain at some point. Those connections are still there. You've just lost the ability to recognize or recall that information. So with relearning, it reactivates those previous neural connections. So long after you can't recall, you can still recognize it. And even after you can't recognize it, relearning will still happen faster. Then finally, testing effects. This is enhanced memory after retrieving rather than rereading or recognizing information. So when you take short answer or essay tests, you'll actually learn the information better. So I strongly recommend, it's why I'm like have you all do those EQ guides and not just like multiple choice practice, because when you write down that information, when you recall that information and pull that information from your brain, you're also learning it. You're also creating those long-term memories. Ebbinghaus, one of the more important characters, Bokeh terms you should know, in his forgetting curve, he had people learn nonsense symbols, and he showed that more rehearsal increases retention, especially when practice is distributed over time. That's the biggie. The more and more that we rehearse, the amount of time it takes to relearn something goes down. So nonsense syllables, meaning like, as I said, like random letters put together. You're going to take a long time to learn it on that first day, but then the next day, it's going to take a little less time. You learn it the next day, you're learning a little less time. So if something makes no sense to you at all, the more you look at it, the more you do it, the more you'll be able to help memorize it. So space out your learning. Don't do it all the night before. We can also give ourselves these retrieval cues. These can help us retrieve information a little bit easier. These are things that like trigger us to help remember things like smells, taste, and sights. This is why I have you all pull up media or some form of picture or meme or image or something like that to associate with your vocabulary, because those are some of the most potent things to help us retrieve information. So whenever it comes time for the test and you see a word and you've got to use that on a short answer question, you will likely associate first the image that you put with that on your vocab card. And then you'll take that and think, okay, so what did that mean? Why did I use that? That'll help you retrieve the information. That leads to some really interesting things like state dependent and context dependent memory. Context dependent meaning that you will more effectively be able to retrieve information if you're in the same environment where you learned it. They did a study with deep sea divers, literally scuba divers, and they had them learn information there, and then they tested them either on land or underwater. And those that were tested underwater and did the water that were in the same context did better, right? Even for those that like they did water and land, so you studied them underwater and then you took the test on land, which you would think you would do pretty well in memorizing, because then you're no longer in a scuba diving suit. They did worse than people who were water and water in the same context, where they took the test in the same environment that they learned the materials. So this learning things and then retrieving them in the same context is going to make things more effective for you. So ideally, you would, and I used to do this actually when I took psychology classes in college. I remember for my Psych 101 class, I was like, I'm going to try that. And I would go into the school, because usually the classroom buildings were unlocked, and I'd go into the room wherever I took the test, and I would sit in the desk that I sat in every time, and I would study for like 4 or 5 hours. I don't know if it actually helped me. I got an A in the class, but Felt like it did. I don't know. Learning it in the same context that you're taking the test. And then state dependent learning is that if you learn things in one mental state, it makes you more easily to recall it in the same mental state. Did that for people similar to the scuba diving study. They did a drunk sober study and found that people that studied things while they were drunk actually did better. They could remember and retrieve that information even better if they were drunk than if they were sober. Right? But if they were sober, they clearly couldn't do it if they were drunk. So it's, again, within the same context or state that you were in. Mood congruence is kind of the same thing. If you were in a grumpy mood whenever you took it, you're going to retrieve better in a grumpy mood. If you're in a happy mood when you're studying, you'll likely retrieve the information better in that same mood. Serial positioning effect, one of the last things we'll talk about today, this is that primacy and recency bias. It's when you're given a list of things to remember, always look at the first and last things. Okay, first and last things. Those are going to be much more likely for you to remember them. Right, the primacy is the first, recency is the last, and that actually changes over time. Right, the later when you're asked to recall, you typically only recall the very first thing that you did. We're very likely to remember things that we did at the beginning of a list. We're less likely to remember stuff in the middle. But in the short term, we're more likely to remember things at the end as well. So primacy and recency. That's that for today. We'll call it a day there, and I will see y'all in class. We got one more ed puzzle for 4.5, and that should do it. Much love.